Next, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about trigger modifications. Certainly there are many different options out there for trigger modifications, but we see that being one of the most prominent modifications or upgrades that people do when it comes to their defensive pistol. In one particular example here, I have a Smith Wesson M&P Shield, and this one has a modified trigger. So essentially I've installed an Apex trigger on this particular platform, and a lot of people will modify the triggers on their firearm because of personal preference. Usually there's nothing wrong with the trigger on a firearm coming from the factory. They're done to run perfectly fine and so on and so forth. However, most of this is driven by preference in, say, the person's finger strength, shooting abilities, and other slew of reasons. But in this particular case, I particularly modified this trigger to basically improve the trigger system. And what I mean by that is, in 2013, Smith & Wesson did have a recall on their stock triggers on their shields. Now, the trigger is essentially a plastic trigger that has a trigger safety by a hinge point on the trigger itself, which a lot of people find to be mushy or just doesn't feel right because you have a hinge point in the middle of the actual trigger itself. Neither here nor there. It's a perfectly fine trigger. It's just that some people just don't like it. Personally, I didn't like it because of the feel, as well as the fact that it already has had a recall. So I changed it out altogether and modified it to an Apex trigger that you see here. Now, unlike the stock trigger, there is an actual trigger safety on it, which protrudes from the trigger itself. And what it does is it actually makes the trigger press a little bit smoother, a little bit softer, taking it from essentially about a 4-pound trigger press down to about a 3.5-pound trigger press on this one. So the Apex trigger here works really well, and I'll show you from this angle so you can see. So a really nice slack here. I get to the wall, and from wall to break, it's really smooth and it's short. Okay, so that's another important thing when shooting. The amount of distance from the wall of the trigger to the break of the round is important. If you have long travel, typically that will lend itself to the opportunity for more disruption of the firearm as you're squeezing the trigger, thereby affecting your overall accuracy. But because of this particular trigger, it has a nice crisp wall that I know where it's at, and it has a really short wall to break that is really defined. So something like this can really be a good upgrade or modification to the stock trigger on a firearm. So another reason why people would do it. Okay. Another type of trigger modification that people do, and that's on this platform. On this one I have the SIG 229. Okay, it looks, and it is essentially the stock trigger itself, but another type of trigger modification that can be done is essentially adjusting the trigger press. And actually there's another part of it that works with the internals here, but what SIG has done, and this I sent back to the factory, is they polished up the feed ramp, changed out the spring on the slide, as well as adjusting the trigger itself from about an 8.5-pound trigger press on double action to about a 6.5-pound trigger press on double action. Okay, double action is when that hammer has to go back, all the way back, then forward to actuate the trigger. So the travel on the trigger itself is going to be longer in double action than it would be in single action. In single action, I barely have to move the trigger in order to go from wall to break. So that first round will be a long travel, but all the subsequent rounds after that will be in single action. Now, the part of this trigger modification that was done, again, using stock trigger parts, we've taken that trigger press force down from 8.5 to 6.5, and that single action press has been reduced down to about 3 pounds. So it takes about 3 pounds to go from wall to break on this particular modification. As well, the travel here the travel here from single action from wall to break has been significantly reduced. So I'll probably give you a closer look here, but you can see the amount of travel that this finger has to go from wall to break is very, very little. So again, going from the concept of having little movement with little or less opportunity to disrupt the trigger as you're squeezing disrupt the firearm as you're squeezing the trigger is important, as it does directly translate into to accuracy. So one of the big drivers for trigger modifications, as it does relate to shooting performance, has to do with that. And then everything else around that is predicated on preference, maybe shooter's capabilities. If you have, say, shorter fingers or not as much hand or finger strength, something like the second modification on that SIG platform might be a beneficial thing that one can do, because now you're instead of having to generate that 8.5-pound trigger press, which might be hard on the double action, it would make it easier, and somebody with smaller or not as good hand strength can actually manipulate that firearm safely. So it does fall into the realm of a safety aspect. So making sure that your trigger is in good working order and certainly works for you is absolutely important. So those are some things around the trigger that we see, and is one of the most common modifications that we see in defensive pistols. Like this video? Be sure to register and sign up for our next CCW class, and we look forward to training with you.